Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to WX Live webinar number 148. This morning we have Jeff Graham, and he's going to be presenting new version 20 features for HFSQL SQL. So good morning, and everybody sit back and enjoy. It's all yours, Jeff.
Good morning and happy May Day to everyone. I want to start with a couple of comments about the last webinar on HFSQL 101. And I said this is the trigger table where if you modified something, it would immediately show the trigger results in the top table and not in the bottom table. And the reason for that is this table is loaded in memory, and I couldn't remember that during the webinar. So I just wanted to point that out. And also the stored procedures that we showed, back when I wrote it, it was HLoad parameter and HSave parameter to pass things to the stored procedures. Well, now you just pass normal parameters as well. Anyway, let's go to the new version 20 HFSQL Control Center. And this is the new layout. I imagine a lot of you have installed it and looked at it, but if you haven't, it's a pretty nice interface. This is the server itself, and of course you have the connections, you have databases, users, groups, transactions, scheduled elements. I don't have any scheduled elements, backups that have been performed, and notifications. These are old, very old notices, which you can delete them off and whatever. And of course, these are the queries and the normal update of the server. And we'll get into these things a little along the way here. Notice this sidebar is dependent on whether you're looking at the server or whether you're looking at a database, and it changes. You still have connections, schedule, and these are related directly to the database. The parameters that have been used for this database, that was when we showed the backup procedure in the last webinar, those parameters from there. Stored queries are listed, triggers, stored procedures, and there is a function up here for synchronizing these things as well. Now, this is the queries. Here's a query. We were doing the search query, and I have a query open here that we were testing with, and I'll kind of show you more about that in a bit. But now, one of the features is the detachable tabs, where you can bring off this query. And then I have another here. This is the base table that this query is from. So I can drag that off and have both of them open at the same time. And you can resize them so you can put them side by side and compare the data. And I've covered up my notes here. Then you can put these back. Now, one problem I did notice that if you try and close the whole control center with these detached, it sometimes doesn't handle it very well. That's feature 150, is this new ribbon interface. And you see that it changes based on what you're looking at. And for a file, you have all the standard things that you had in the old one and a few more. On the left over here, in the tree view, you see that the materialized views show up, the views show up, and all the files, the tables, as always. Now this little arrow indicates that the details have been shown. So come over here and we look at general. Now these is considered the details of the files, views, and whatever. Notice they're not all shown. So up here you have a drop down that says display the details of the ones selected, or you can say of all the files. Now, come on. There we go. Didn't click right on it. Now that shows then the details, the number of records, the size of all the ones. You notice material views, which we'll get into later, has, it's just like a file, except that you create them in a different way. That's number 151, detachable tabs. 152, new feature, is simultaneous data edits. So here is a query, and I can come in here and actually modify a field in the query. This happens to be our record in a client's database. So if we do that, and then we go over to the names table by resizing it. I want to go to content. Okay, and it put in the change. You see it's there. I can take it out here and go back over to the query and where do we go here? Now, to get it to show here, we have to run the query again. And you see it's gone. So you can simultaneously edit queries, tables, and write directly from the control center. The 153 is a new query editor with IntelliSense. Now let's close this query. Oh, I wanted to show you about this. I actually took that generalized search query that we went through in the last webinar, copied the SQL code and pasted it in here. And of course it won't run when you have the parameter type format. So I just commented out all the parameters except the ones I wanted to use and ran it. So it's a handy thing if you want to actually go straight to data with a query that you had before. Now, if we, let's get a new query. And here you specify the database it's on. And if you type names, dot, and then your field, so it's, you can create you've got all your full IntelliSense. That's a nice feature. So it didn't have that before. In fact, the old one, you had to use a really weird format to do queries within the Hyperfile Control Center. The 154 is you have the query history. And that's accessible from here. And now these are all the queries that I've recently done, but you can also go to the history of queries and it lists all the queries you've run, those that failed, and those that were new. This was when I was editing that generalized search. This is really nice. And then you can say the current connection only. And then if you select one of these, it'll bring it in, and you've got it there, and you can do more with it. And then you can save these by saying save as, and pick a location that you want to put them. Any questions about the control center? I'm close these out. Oops, there's like a showing you. It's not rock solid yet.
You found an undocumented feature. Yeah, there's no questions yet, by the way, Jeff.
Okay, so just say no. Okay, we'll come back to this during the SQL views and so forth, and see some more. Now, SQL views is a nice feature. Let's go over to here, and we'll close out this window. Now, to create a view, you can do it from the analysis, or you can right-click in the analysis panel over here and say new view, or you can select from the analysis ribbon and say new. And if you notice, you can add a new data file, a view, a query, trigger, stored procedures, and to create materialized views, you actually go to the type of view, and you have two different types of view. The views can only have data in them. There's no parameters available except for values. So if you want to create a new view, then you pick a name on it, and we'll just use that for now. And you can either enter SQL code directly, you can copy and paste, or you can use the standard query editor. Let's just look at that real quick. So you have all the same features. Now, when you're creating a view, you can actually use queries both from your project and from your, SQL views can only use queries that are stored queries or other views or materialized views. So you are restricted in that respect. But you can use copy and paste SQL code. So let's just pick, put out contacts, and we'll put out first name, last name, and title. Now, if you say new condition on there, you notice the parameter is grayed out, but you can specify a value, and that's most useful in the materialized view, where you are creating for example, a date range, which is what I've done on my materialized views that we'll look at later. And when you save this view, all right, you could back into here, you run the query test, and if it's the data you want, and then it should, now you see the new view over here, my view, with the fields that we put in it. So that's how you create a view And these views also have, as feature number 162 says, that it uses the standard statistics reporting, data binding, and everything that like any query would. And we'll show using these queries in just a moment. Now, if we go back to the analysis and we say new view and select a materialized view, I'll just use the default again, then you can actually use a view to create a materialized view. So you put all these fields over here, and if let's do something that has, well, this is just for the sample. And again, when you run the query test, okay, there's one other feature here that one other step. When you go to My View, there's another piece of creating the view is you have to specify the description of the view. And this is where you say what connection the view is going to use. And that was why this one, well, we have to generate first. Not description, analysis, generation. And we'll update. And now it's adding the materialized view and the view that we did. Now in the materialized view, you also have to specify what connection to use.
Hey, we have a question for you, Jeff.
Okay.
And I was going to ask this question myself, but it's from Dan. I'm glad he asked it. Question is, what is the difference between a view and a materialized view, and when would you use each, and why?
Okay. A view is basically a specification of a query that so that you have particular fields or a standard. So in fact, if we get down here and one of the features that they list in 156 is to use it for security. So let's say you wanted people to have some of the information in a payroll file or table, but you didn't want to have any access to passwords, security names, or whatever. You can define a view that selects those limited number of fields that you want someone else to have access to without having access to the sensitive data. And you can also have different rights on a view than you do of the data. And so then they're seeing live data through a view. A materialized view creates a file that is, let's just look at the definition of one of these. Oh, no, I'm going to open it. In a materialized view, it creates a snapshot of the data and stores it on the server. And if we go back over here to the server and look at this, see, these materialized views are actually files. Now, there's functions that you can refresh these views if the data changes and you need it. And what I did is use these views to have data from a particular month and year for the service days of our meals program and a count of those service days. This is a view of a view. We go back over to the definition.
Hey, Jeff, I have a question.
Sure.
Are those are materialized views? Is that hyperfile jargon, or is that database wide? I mean, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, all of them use the same term.
Well, I did some searches on for materialized views, and that is a common term. That is not hyperfile term. Now, I can't tell you whether they use the same term in SQL Server or not, but it's certainly, you'll see definitions for materialized views in, if you search, do a Google search on it. It's in Wikipedia and that kind of thing. But it's basically a snapshot of the data. And to me, the thing that would be most useful, say you wanted to have a table that shows sales or transactions of a particular month or summaries or whatever, and you had, or for a year. So you had last year, this year, or whatever, and you didn't want to recreate that. If it's a long calculating process or whatever, you don't want to recreate it every time. So you create a materialized view, and it's there. You can go back and read it quickly at any time and get the information that you need without regenerating it for past time. So I hope that answers the question. Like in this case, I had a condition in here. And materialized views can have values entered like this. So this is how I get for December 2013, is by putting a condition on there with the values. You can't pass parameters to it, but you can use the parameters for that purpose. I hope that answers the question.
It does for me, thank you.
Okay, and now we have a view for the same kind of thing as we have up here. This is, the view is a generalized process that you can use, and we'll get into that in a minute. Well, we just go look at that right now. Let's just run this. Okay, so this is a new function with a, I don't guess it's a new function, but it's expanded. This is creating the, let's not do that right now. To get a list of all the stored elements on the server, you specify the connection HListAll, and then we'll see what it produces. So it gives you a list of all the stored procedures, stored queries, and I think it lists triggers too. Yeah, these are the triggers, and these are the stored procedures and the stored queries. Now let's test a view. And I have them stops in here so that you can see the code. Here we're going to use a view, and you do it by doing an HExecute query of the view, just like you would with a query in your project. And one of the reasons for using views and materialized views also is that they're on the server and they do not require a particular application. So multiple applications that use the same database can have the same views, and you don't have to update 2 different applications or 6 different applications that use the same database. You put them on the server and all of them have access to them. One change to the server and then everyone sees that change. And it doesn't require recompilation. That's one of the features that they listed on views. And same with materialized views. They exist on the server and on the server only. Now, you can update them from any application's analysis, and you would have to control that. And so anyway, we execute the query, and then I'm just going through and counting the number of service days, and then I execute the query on the count service days, which is a query, a view of a view. If let's just look at that. See, we're actually using the view service days, counting the transactions like we did in the previous webinar on HyperFile servers. So if we go back to our code, and then what I did here is also to show that your H number records can be used just like normal. So it counted 243 records in the service days for the entire table. Now, you can also use filters on there, whatever you don't want to. You can basically do anything.
We have another question for you, Jeff.
Okay.
It's from Dan. If a view is a subset of a file, how is a view different than a query?
A view isn't a, oh, you mean field-wise. The view can be, it's basically the same as a query, except it's stored on the server for use by all the different applications. So if you need to share queries, instead of copying the queries from one application to another, like we typically do, or at least we do, and then you can put it on the server and everyone has that access. That's one advantage to it and the reason you would do it. Now, there's a functions, this is a new function in there to update the view. So if you've changed the view or you're on a database a new database that you're creating, you want to put the view in there, you can execute the update view. And the true says update it whether it's there or not. And if you put false in here, it says put the view on this database only if it's there. So if you have you're connecting into a new database and you've got you want to take your views and put it on that database, then you can use update view. Or you can use the synchronization techniques to update them as well. So I'll just continue on here. Now, there's it's updating the views. Or did I click on this? Okay, now we want to look at materialized views. And materialized views do not have to be, you don't execute a query on the materialized view. It's basically the same as a file. So now we're going to get into, there is a problem that I have not been able to resolve in the new HyperFile Control Center. And that is when you have a view, let's look at these real quick. We already looked at this one, I think. This is the materialized view where it had a date range. Okay, and that will select all the unique days that there are transactions in that time period. But in this one, which is a materialized view using another materialized view, the one that it counts the unique days, so it comes back with a number of just one number of the number of days in that year. Okay, and let's make this clearer. Okay, if you see the count service days here, both of them only have 2 records, one for breakfast, one for lunch. And if we look at the data, there's the 2 records. But the data that it came from has all these records in it. So it's a view of a view. It's a materialized view based on another materialized view, which I don't think is not a lot of reasons for that, except in this unique case where we had to come up with the number of unique days that any meal was served for reporting purposes to the state. So I used that as an example. So coming back to the code here, and you will see that I tried to do it with the for each, like up here, and I was getting errors. So I tried with the read first, while each found, and so forth. And let's just kind of step through this. And you see that on the service days, the one that is just materialized days, it's based on a view. But if you come down here, and when you're doing the one that is a materialized view of a materialized view, you get an error. And it says that the materialized view count stored in the analysis is not compatible with the one stored in the physical file. Well, you can see that the physical file is there, and we should be able to read it, but it does not work. And now if you come down here and try to use the H number record on this count service days, it also gets the same error. So we do a go, and you'll see that it's again saying the analysis doesn't match the physical file. And I have tried every trick that I know of synchronizing from you can synchronize from the server, you can synchronize from the analysis, you can delete the compiled database, recompile, repair the application. I've done all those steps, and I cannot get it to get in sync. At one time it was in sync, but when I made a couple of changes to add these, change the tests around, it got this error, and I could not get it in sync again. And I'm going to report it to PCSoft thing. As soon as they come out with a Go version, I think that this will be taken care of. I know they had some problems with the French version, according to Thomas, that in this area that was finally fixed in the last release of the French version. So when we get our final release, it will probably take care of this issue, but I'll report it anyway. And this is just the other version. Now, you have code. Oh, I didn't show the code on this. Let's look at the code real quick. You can refresh the views a couple of ways. And one is by using the new command hrefreshView, and that refreshes the materialized views as well. Or you can do the sync, or in the control center, you have the ability to, synchronize the database. So you can run it right here. Pick the analysis, and it'll actually do the synchronization from the control center. It takes a moment. And open it again, and you see everything is there. But that does not
We have another
fix the
question,
problem.
Jeff,
Okay.
from Dan. Is a view the same as a SQL view, or are the two things different?
Well, no, a view is a SQL view. That's what the new feature is. When you create a view, you either create a view, if you select a view, that's the SQL view that gets stored on the client server. If when you create a new view, you select the materialized view, then it creates the materialized view. So it's the new view. If we go back to, okay, if you create, it calls it views, but that's the SQL view in the new features. The materialized views is, again, a view, and this is really the SQL views that they talk about in the feature. It's just a view that's stored on the server, and that's what they call the SQL view. Does that make it clear, I hope? And then the view, there is a function called HModifyViewRights, which I don't have a demonstration of, that gives the view, changes the rights for the view so that you can make it accessible to more people if you like than the data underneath the view it's created on. Here's another view doing the count again of a totally different type of file. And I'll show this because we're going to do some other things with this. Now,
Dan said, yes, that answered the question. Thanks a lot.
okay, good. Now, this is interesting because I do some timing on servers. And this may answer some question too. Now, this code is, I put in here an input that says how many loops we want to go through this reading of this file. And so for the service days and the count service days, we're going through and reading the service days a number of times right here. And then calculating the duration and doing it again for, that's a project query and then a view, and then I have a stored procedure using the queries. So to make that clear, well, let's just look at the results first. Okay, so we need to do a go here and come back to our, okay, and this is the timing. So the project queries duration was 1 second, 230 milliseconds. The view query is 3 seconds, 306. Well, these are much longer times than when I'm running it without it being shared. So have to take that into consideration. They all come up with the same numbers, but this is a project query, this is a view query, and this is a stored procedure query, which means it's totally executing on the server. So let's, all right, we'll just do one more time. So if you do 1,000 of these, let's see what the result is. Okay, they come up with the same numbers. The project query takes a lot less time, and the stored query procedure takes less time than the view. Because the view, you're going to the server and reading the data back and executing it that way. Now, there's another, let's look at the stored procedure. So I know why, and this is the one that we're running. And the code for that is right here, execute procedure, the connection, the run story query, and we're passing it the number of iterations. So now if we look at the code for the run stored query, here's the number of iterations come in, and it executes the query that builds the query on the server memory, and then it goes through and counts the number of loops and returns the results. So that's totally being executed on the server and giving you one result. Now I have another one that is a little different. This is the next one that we're going to show. Then I'm passing parameters to use in the query, and we're executing a query. This is a stored query on the server. Now, these stored queries, the stored procedures can only use stored queries because they're all running on the server. So but the stored queries have parameters. So we're setting the parameters, and we're executing the query name types, which is here, and the count of the name types. And if they failed, it just returns -2 or -1, so you know which one failed. Then it runs through and counts the name types for these parameters here and does it the number of times specified. Then it returns a string that says how many active customers, how many that were in that particular query. And that comes from the count name type. And then it gives the number of query name types, which is this counting loop here, and the number of loops it executed for. It'll be a little more clear, I think, when we run this. So we'll just do one loop to start with. And we go back here. And you see the project duration is much shorter than the stored query duration. And but I'm only doing project queries and stored query on this, not a view. I didn't have a view defined for it. But they come up with the same number, 982, 982. And then these are the other counts that come from reading the count query. It's interesting that, let's do this again. I'll take this stop off and do it. Oh, my numslot must not be on. Let's do it 5,000 times. Now, when I was running and testing, that made a big difference. Now, starting the project queries. Now, it's starting the stored procedure using stored queries, and there are the results. Now, you notice the project query duration was 10 seconds, and the stored query one is 4 seconds. So if you're doing a lot of calculation on a data, you can save some time by creating a stored procedure and a stored query that calculates your data and returns the results to you. But it won't, until you're doing a lot of calculation, it doesn't save time because there is overhead of starting the query on the server that we saw in the other case. Let's see. It kind of covers materialized views and stored procedures and SQL views. Now there's 2 other new features that are not explicitly hyperfile features. They came up with a new data type of enumerations and combinations. And it so happens that you can define those data types and combinations on the server, which is what these are here. Now, if you haven't looked at that yet, the enumerations is, let's go to the code. Let's just look at the definition first. Okay, this is address types. We have shipping, mailing, other things. And shipping returns a 2, mailing returns a 1, other returns 3. And then you can have an alias. And in this case, it's returning other. And you can select which one that you want to return. So we define these. Now using them in the code is, let's look at the, okay, we'll stick with types first. And we'll go here and enumeration code. No, I want the code. Okay, now this is, we're going to end up with some, this is the second little bug that I found with the hyperfile. You can, to use the address types that is defined there that we were looking at, you declare a variable is address types. And then you should be able to specify, use this syntax right here to specify what it is. Now, let's run the test first. And it's returning, you see the eAddress test name is set to shipping, so you can access the actual name of the type, and you can also access the value that it returns for that name. Okay, and I also tried to pass that name type to a stored procedure, and you get this error saying you cannot pass that type. It's not supported. Now let's look at combinations. Now a combination, the different is it's also a name type thing, but you can have multiple. When we look at the definition, active, customer, vendor, and then an alias is set to customer. Okay, so but in a combination you can set it equal to 2 different values in there. Now if we continue on, it tells us that it was set, then the name value returns active plus vendor, and the value returns I didn't show that on there. These are the values for active, customer, vendor. And I put the semicolon so that it makes them clear in the result. And then the other thing, we set an alias to test the alias. It gave it the alias value, and sure enough, it returned customer, like the alias was defined to do. Now, again, the advantage to doing this on the HyperFile server is that, again, all the types were then shared by all the applications that use that database. And different databases could have different name types, if that made sense, but it allows it to share them. Now, what I wanted to show you about the, no, cancel. Oops, have to go back over here. Clicked on the wrong one. Enumerations. Show you the problem here. So let's end the test. Now, we should be able to say, like this right here, comments off, and we save. It's working this time. If we do this test equal mailing, notice it sticks address types dot mailing in, and if you save it, it's doing it. I was having a problem where it was giving errors whenever I did this, and it would not compile. So let's see if it does compile. Well, it is now. Interesting. Well, that's good. So, but you should be not have to say, it was coming out with an error saying there was a conflict between mailing and address mailing. That was probably when I was messing around trying to get the materialized views. But obviously either one works and we don't get an error. So if we do this now and come back over and run the test, let's see what it gives us. Now it's set to mailing and the value returns 1. That's good. How's our time? We're almost up.
You have about 6 minutes.
Okay. Let's run through the new functions available for client-server management. You can, we didn't go over scheduling, but you can add scheduling for stored procedure, backup, optimization, refresh of a materialized view. You can delete the scheduling, execute the scheduling, and here's where you change the view rights in the list scheduling. Modify scheduling, modified view rights. This is where we're talking about where you can by programming, you can go in and say, well, this person or this user has the rights to it, or it's read only or whatever. And update the view, which we showed that. Now, there's a couple of new ones in just HQL. You can compare 2 items and import XLS. And refresh the views, which we did that. And this is a new nice thing. Instead of having to determine whether you were adding or modifying, you can just say HSave, and if it exists, it modifies it. If it doesn't exist, it adds a new record, which that's a nice feature. I haven't tested that, but it is a nice feature. So unless there's questions, that's, oh, I wanted to show you one other thing. In a stored procedure, let's say, there's the ability to test it when you're, let's go to the analysis, and you can run a test of a stored procedure. When you're writing one, this is very handy. So this one only has one parameter, and then you can run the procedure, and you get the result back. Okay. And if you're running one that has more parameters, it lists all the parameters. You can give the value that you want to test with, run the procedure, and it gives you back the results. So that's really handy for writing these procedures that you want to store on the server and run, and then you can schedule them and all those features. This one, which is the one that we demonstrated last time for doing the backups, you notice it doesn't have any parameters because I used HSave parameter and HLoad parameter to pass the data to it. And if you try to run this, it's going to get an error because it doesn't have the parameters. I think you can, what I'll go back and do is change that to use pass parameters instead of the HSave and HLoad. That was, let's see if there's anything else I wanted to cover. Okay, and of course, under analysis, that's the other way. You have under synchronization, you can update the stored elements. And what that does is brings up everything except materialized views and views. But the stored procedures, the triggers, and the stored queries can all be updated, and you can select them all. And then you click on Update, and they're updated on the server. That's one way. And we saw the other way in the Hyperfile Control Center that you could update from there. Then you can also, from this analysis ribbon, you can do the standard synchronization. And I think let's do this. The terminology has changed. It's the structure and the data deployed now. And this is where I was, and I'm only updating our test database. Now, it is showing the items that are going to be updated. And it's not showing all the materialized views. And what I really want to do is update the counts and synchronize, and I couldn't get it to do that. And it was probably going, oh, it did it. Okay. So those are the two different ways of updating all these new features on the Hyperfile client server. And I think that's it, unless there's any questions.
Okay, I don't see any questions here. Hearing no other questions,